So last week we did works on paper, and I'll just bring us up to speed. We basically started with manuscripts, and then we looked at how manuscripts were kind of revived in the 20th century with the arts and crafts movement. So we kind of started with manuscripts. We also looked at drawings, a different type of paper use, and we talked about how political drawings are, because often they just show artists' doodles. I am recording to the person asking. I do always forget, but not this time. And then we looked at collage, very political collages. This one is perhaps the most obviously political one we looked, that incorporated war photographs. So that was kind of the third use of paper that we did. But we talked mainly about Picasso, and that's where I'm going to start, because he was so creative with his use of paper, and there were just a few examples that I didn't get to go over last week. And yeah, he was so experimental with paper that it's kind of a nice place to start in a class about paper. So the link to this exhibition is in the class notes from last week. It's a virtual exhibition now, and it's really worth seeing at the Royal Academy. And the catalogue of the exhibition includes, I have to include these, I just think they're so nice. It includes these letters that Picasso wrote, and it has a whole section on how much he drew when he wrote letters, and he used watercolor and stamps, and I just think they're so lovely. And I think this exhibition really gives you a sense of how incessantly Picasso just made stuff and drew stuff. Whatever surface he could find, he would just draw on it. Like, we looked at some of his drawings on newspapers last week as well, and I just wanted to include this one because it's a better example of Picasso's political doodles. So it's obviously got the communist sickle in the background of this newspaper. We also looked at Frida Kahlo's doodles. This is Frida Kahlo's very political, annotated, very cynical representation of the Statue of Liberty. But what really caught people's attention the most was printing, because we looked at this very famous series of engravings by Picasso from towards the end of his life, or in his later career, from 1968. And we were talking about how it seems that Picasso starts to think more critically about the relationship between the male artist and the female nude, which is a relationship that's just been taken for granted throughout the history of art, really. It just seemed normal for this to happen so consistently. But he starts to kind of question it. He starts to make the man look a bit creepy. It almost feels like he's having doubts about about this relationship between the female artist and the female nude and the male artist. So I won't kind of go into that whole series again because we went over it last week, but I just wanted to include in this class these two collages that Picasso made that are included in the Picasso and Paper exhibition. And he basically would just cut out magazine snippets, and doodle on them. And I just think they kind of underline his really cynical feelings about men in this period. He makes them look really quite creepy, and I think he's kind of commenting on the hypersexualization of women now in the 1960s, and maybe in his engraving series he's wondering to what extent he's taken part in this, you know, with the amount of female nudes that he's painted throughout his career. So yeah, I wanted to start with Picasso again to underline this point. When we looked at the engravings, these 156 engravings, there were a ton of questions about printing and engraving and woodblock and all the different types of printing. So that's kind of what we're now going to focus on today, starting with Picasso, but then going in many directions, but hopefully it will more or less make sense. I just wanted to include this here to get us started, because this is another one of Picasso's many prints. Instead of being an engraving like this one, this is actually a lino cut. So that kind of gets us started talking about technique. Lino cut is a kind of a synthetic material, and it's really soft, so you can make grooves in it really easily. So it became really popular in the 20th century for artists like Picasso, who were, trying to revive printmaking. And I included this image because it includes the original lino cut. And it's just so that you can see that the same lino cut can be used to create two completely different images. So the image on the right, the black and white image on the right, and the image on the left are made with the same print. It just depends how much of the print you cover in white paint or whatever color you choose. So for Picasso, this was perfect, because we discussed in the history of Spanish painting class how he was quite obsessive about things, and when he liked a painting, he copied it to no end. We looked at Velázquez's Las Meninas and saw how he did many repetitions of his own versions of this old master painting. And this print that we're looking at now is another example of that. So he's basically doing his own version of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass in English, and which was a really famous painting of the 19th century. So it's seen as a painting that sort of jump-started the Impressionist movement, when artists rejected academic historical painting and started painting scenes of everyday life. So Picasso really wanted to kind of explore everything about this painting, because he thought it was so important in the history of art. And he was really thorough in his art history. He was really, really keen to understand all of the painters that came before him. So this print is just one of so many on this theme. So yeah, I actually included these to show that he also made these little cardboard cutouts of the figures in Manet's painting. And on the left, you can see these mask kind of figures that he made just from burning paper. I just included this to show you another example of how he just never stopped making stuff, and it really didn't matter what material it was. But paper in particular for him was so easily accessible, so cheap, not precious, that it was good for his creative outlet, I suppose. So I mentioned that Picasso liked to understand the great art historical, great according to traditional art history, painters that came before him. And that's actually why he was so keen to try lots of different types of printing, because as we'll see throughout this lesson, many of the most famous artists in Western art history were printmakers. So it's definitely a medium that doesn't get enough attention. And from all your questions last week, it just made me realize it really is something that needs to be talked about in a whole session and really properly understood. Because there's lots of different types of printmaking as well. So we're looking at lino cuts here with Picasso, but he also did traditional engravings, and that's just scraping metal, making grooves in metal. And this is, yeah, I just had to include this because it's one of my favorite engravings of all time, and it gives you a sense of how different the effect of different techniques is. And I just love, I think the hands in this are just some of the best in, I don't know, the history of art. They're so effective. And he really, like, he really chooses he matches the subject to the technique. Like the whole point of this painting is that, of this image, I suppose, is that it's meant to look really harsh and hard, I suppose, because the subject that it's depicting is not an easy one. He's talking about poverty, basically. So yeah, he is an artist who thought very carefully about the relationship between the subject and the material. And you know, I won't say anything more about this engraving, but I just think it's so good. But we have to move beyond Picasso, because otherwise we'll just stay there forever. So instead of doing another class on Picasso, I thought we would do a history of printmaking to understand how we even got to this point in the 20th century. If there's any questions before I go into that more historical stuff, please let me know. I'll just check on the WhatsApp. So far, so good. Yeah, feel free to interrupt anytime. But for the time being, I will just carry on. So something very different now. Printmaking, as we've said, there are lots of different types. You can print on metal and make an engraving. You can print on liner cuts. But the earliest type of printmaking that existed is woodblock printing. And it was invented in China, which makes sense because paper was invented in China. Not the kind of Egyptian papyrus paper, but more like paper as we understand it today. Papyrus, which was like ancient paper, was different because it was ground up plants, which kept the kind of rough surface of the leaf, whereas Chinese paper, basically its big innovation was that it combined plants with like textile fibres, so the whole thing was much more smooth. So that's why we say that the Chinese really invented paper. And yeah, it's a kind of short step really from having paper to starting to print on it with woodblocks. And this image that you're looking at, the Diamond Sutra, is one of the first, it's thought to be the first woodblock print ever created. As you can see, over 1,000 years old. And it was discovered actually by accident in 1900 by a monk on the old, on one of the old outposts of the Silk Road. He came across this cave and it turned out to be full, I think the number is, yeah, full of 40,000 scrolls, which is just crazy. All Buddhist scrolls that had been hidden in around the year 1000 apparently, to protect them. You know, this, we've talked a little bit about the dissemination of Buddhism from its kind of origins in northern India, and it had reached China by this point, but it was definitely competing with other religions, so this must have been a kind of way to save some of the key texts. So yeah, this is thought to be the oldest, and the Chinese, yeah, the Chinese brought, well, I suppose you can't say they brought, thanks to the Silk Road and trade and all this stuff, paper arrived in Europe. I'll give you the exact year. In 1151. Yeah, so the first paper manufacturing mill was actually in Spain in that year. And I just wanted to mention that the relationship between China and Spain I've always found really interesting, because there seems to be so many different historical connections between them. Like paper first arrives in Spain, and also later when Spain is and the reason for that, by the way, is because at this point Spain was an Islamic, well, kingdom primarily, connected to the Silk Road, so it was a huge receiver of trade goods, for example. But when Spain colonized the Philippines, and the exact date is 1565. So yeah, when it colonized the Philippines, it suddenly had this port in the middle, basically between China and Spain, and loads of stuff came through Manila. And actually that's why fans are so popular in Spanish culture, and they're used in flamenco dance, because they were imported from China. And also these silk shawls that they use in flamenco dance as well, which we actually call Manila shawls, were originally from China and came through Manila, through the Philippines. Complete tangent, but just interesting for any historians. So anyway, what happened in Europe when Spain first started producing paper? Interestingly, very interestingly, one of the first uses of paper and, you know, woodblock printing, which kind of went hand in hand, was actually the production of cards, like playing cards. And that's because we'll see in this class that it took a while for people to treat paper in Europe like a useful, creative medium. So at this point, you can see it was sort of functional, and woodblock printing was really functional, and it was made by craftsmen. And they wanted to use it for things that need repetitive patterns like playing cards. I couldn't help but include this set of playing cards in New York in the Metropolitan Museum cloisters. They're actually hand drawn, they're not woodblock printed, so it's not really the best example I could find, but they are just great. I had to include them. If you can see them in person, yeah, I think it's really worth looking at them. And the set together just looks so nice. Yeah, and it's interesting to, I think, when you're looking at the medieval period or the Renaissance, to look at games and how they used to play games. Like I think last week, one of the manuscripts we looked at was a book of games, was it called? Which I just think is interesting, because often it's I mean, it's meant to be fun, so people are most creative, and there's loads of nice stuff to look at. So yeah, I had to include these. And then when I included these in the class, this is another tangent, and I promise we will go roughly chronologically, but I just couldn't help but include these. I remembered something that should really go in a class about paper is these Surrealist playing cards from 1940, which are just one of the most interesting works of art, made by a group of about 7 Surrealists, I think it was, who had been living in Paris. They were of all different nationalities, but they'd been living in Paris, connected by the Surrealist group, and they were forced to flee from the Nazi occupation. And they were hiding in the south of France, in Marseille, which is why this pack of cards that they produced is called the Marseille playing cards. And while they were in hiding, they decided to produce a new set of playing cards, because it was basically the only creative outlet that they had. It had to be something small, it had to be something portable that they could take with them whenever they wanted, and it also had to be something that wouldn't be questioned if they were found, something that they could just keep in their pockets. So playing cards was like the best solution they had to keep producing art. And they actually filled the playing cards with all these political messages. Like the figure on the right is Pancho Villa, who was one of the most, he was a really important Mexican revolutionary in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And then on the left, you've got Freud, who for the Surrealists was, I mean, almost like a god. And they were obsessed with his psychological writings. So they replace all of the traditional figures on playing cards with their own heroes, which is very typical of the Surrealists to kind of reject all hierarchies and stuff like that. Anyway, it's a tangent from the medieval playing cards, but I just had to include it to show again how paper is really interesting because it's portable. So it's often artists often turn to it in these moments, like quite extreme moments when they're fleeing, for example, or refugees in this case. So yeah, this is definitely on paper one of the best works on paper, I think. But now we are going to go back to the kind of chronology of printmaking. It like after woodblock printing was introduced, it took a while for it to be adopted by artists. So primarily it was made by craftsmen and it was functional, like I said. And the first artist to actually do printmaking, i.e. someone who hadn't been trained as a craftsman, was a German man called Schongauer. But I didn't include any of his prints, they're 15th century, because he was totally superseded by his most famous admirer, which is Durer, who is much better known in the history of art, and actually known for his oil paintings, really. He may be familiar to some people. You can find lots of his paintings in the National Gallery. And Durer became like the most famous printmaker and the one who started using printmaking for creative purposes. And basically his big innovation was that he turned printmaking into something that wasn't so static and rigid. Like his woodblocks are full of movement and these tiny lines, and if you think about the wood block that would have had to be made to produce something like this, it's actually crazy. And I just highlighted here some of the details that really show you how technical this is, like the band that is stretching across the cross is so tight, and he manages to like create that tension from a block of wood, which is crazy. And he also manages on the bottom here to carve like skin stretching. And then on the right hand side with the Apocalypse print, I mean, it's full of movement. It's literally got horses trampling on people. But the amount of detail is crazy. Actually, this is quite a good reproduction, so you can really see. You have to imagine that there has to be space between each carved bit of wood in order to get these lines. So yeah, it's really, it was a really like transformative, his contribution to printmaking was really transformative. He's most famous, I think, for this print, Durer's Adam and Eve print. And this helps you see the difference stylistically between wood blocks and engravings, one being done with wood and the other with metal. This is just, yeah, it's totally different. You can have a lot more light and shade, a lot more depth. But yeah, for the beginning of the 16th century, this was just crazy in terms of technique, because he manages to make it look almost like a painting. So this medium that had been functional was, I mean, it would never really be the same. I think this a good enough reproduction? Yes, it's a good enough reproduction for you to see just how detailed he is. Like, he even includes spots to make it look like skin, the veins on the arm, the teeth, like the snake's teeth. Yeah, it's absolutely mad. And like the curly hair and the bird, it's crazy. And the amount of depth that he manages to put in the, I want to say jungle, but it's probably a forest, behind them. So yeah, Durer is a really amazing artist. Some of you might be familiar with his drawing of a rabbit. He did a really famous rabbit drawing. It's probably one I should have included in a week on paper. And it's one to look at just to show his like ability to make fur look like fur and skin look like skin. So yes, he is like the first big name to remember in European printmaking. And I just wanted to mention that the effect that this sort of printmaking had on the arts was huge, because prints were so easily disseminated, and Durer did reproduce his prints and disseminate them, meant that artists who were living in Germany could now see the works of art by Italian artists without having to travel there, and vice versa. So previously, in the Renaissance, you typically have this separation between the Northern Renaissance, like what was going on in Germany and the Netherlands, and the Southern Renaissance, or the Italian Renaissance, and they're seen as having like quite distinct styles. But it was really thanks to printmaking, and actually the huge thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is the development of the printing press in 1440, you know, perfect timing for Durer, meant that now engraving and woodblock printing was, yeah, it was entering like a stage of mass production. And you can see slowly what happens is that the Northern and Southern Renaissances kind of blend, and they start to influence each other much, much more. And they lose their kind of stylistic difference, I suppose. And people sometimes say that the Mona Lisa is a really good example of this moment in art history, because it's obviously a really famous Italian Renaissance painting, but you can see in the background that Leonardo has taken inspiration from Northern European landscapes, and he's incorporated this really detailed background, which isn't, I mean, you can see on the right, wasn't at all typical of early Italian Renaissance paintings. It was more typical of the sort of stuff that you see on the right hand side in the north, and he incorporates it in the Mona Lisa. So even though we think of this as like the epitome of the Italian Renaissance, it actually it's a bit of a fusion, and that's all thanks to printing. So yeah, it's hugely important what the printing press did, and also what Durer did. So the big question, I guess, is, let me get to my notes, yeah, is basically what happened, because it was like printing had this huge transformative moment in the Renaissance, and then it sort of just fizzled a bit. And people blame that on the development of something called the mezzotint. Let me read out the method of this. Mezzotint printing was invented in 1642. And instead of being like an engraving or a woodblock technique where you had to scrape away like thick layers and create grooves, it involved what's called the dark to light method. And this basically meant you've got a metal plate, and you got a tool that had like 3 grooves, and you made the whole plate bumpy. So it's basically covered in loads of little dots. And if you printed it at that point, the paper would come out entirely black. So what an artist had to do is then get a smoothing tool and draw their picture into the grooves by making certain parts of the surface flat. And basically what this means is that you can suddenly get prints where you have like the ability to make shadows and go from light to dark really smoothly, and you lose the kind of rough edges of printing. And when you look at these prints from these mezzotint prints from the 19th century, it's something that feels quite familiar, like we've seen them before. You kind of have seen this technique a million times, but you never knew exactly how it was made. And when you describe the invention of the mezzotint, it sounds like something that would be really amazing in the 17th century, but it didn't actually do many favors for printmaking, because it became seen as kind of like too easy, too reproducible, and so it started being used to create like copies of works of art rather than works of art in their own right, if that makes sense. So yeah, the development of the mezzotint in the 17th century, so in 1642, is kind of seen as a moment of decline in printmaking. And it's very difficult to explain the actual techniques, so if it isn't making sense, do ask questions. Someone has very helpfully sent me the amazing Rabbit by Durer, and I'm really not doing it any justice by showing it with my phone, but it's really, I'll post that link on the tools, because it's really worth looking at. And someone has asked a question, what tools did Durer use to carve, and what wood did he use? I don't know what wood he used. That's a good question. But I was wondering if this question would come up, because it's really controversial in the history of art. Some art historians believe that Durer carved his own carved his own wood blocks, and others believe that he just did the design, like drew all of the lines, and then got a craftsman to actually do the grooves, because this was so early on in the development of artistic printmaking. And there's no answer to the debate, really. You can definitely read up more on it, but yeah, there's no answer whether he actually did the carving or not. And you know, does it make a difference? Who knows? It opens up all these questions about all these really conceptual questions about whether an artist needs to actually touch his or her work of art in order to be the author, which sounds really abstract. But I just say that because some of the most famous artists, like Rodin, who did The Thinker, and we've looked at some of his sculptures, did The Kiss, these huge marble sculptures, actually had a huge production factory, and often didn't actually do any chiseling of marble. So sometimes that really affects people's perception of the artist. So it's an interesting debate, maybe one we can go into if we do a class on like conceptual art and stuff. So yeah, I hope I've answered your Durer question, which is essentially that we don't know. So yes, I will now move. Durer is kind of the first big name to remember in European printmaking, but we're moving on to the second big name now, which is Rembrandt. And Rembrandt is seen as the artist who saved printmaking. Is that a bit too dramatic? He basically is credited as someone who turned printmaking into something that wasn't just functional, reproducible, and all this stuff that had made people sort of disregard it. And And I'll kind of try and explain why, although it's hard to do Rembrandt in like 5 minutes. So Rembrandt uses a method. He did do many engravings, but he uses a method that had recently been developed called etching, and it's really useful. I know the technical explanations are not for everyone, and sometimes they can bore some people, but it's really useful with etching to know how they are actually made. And this is kind of the final technical explanation of the day. An etching is made by getting a metal sheet and covering it in acid-resistant wax. Stay with me. And then what the artist does is just scrape away some of the wax in the drawing that they want to create, and then dips it into acid, and all of the exposed non-waxy areas will corrode the acid, and that allows you to create grooves in the metal that you can then print. Did that make sense to anyone? So that's, in theory, how you make an etching. And basically this was a really important development because it meant that instead of drawing with metal on really hard surfaces, artists who wanted to make prints could draw on wax, which was much smoother, obviously. And it allowed Rembrandt to create these really sketchy prints. Like, they often look like drawings, like the self-portraits that we're looking at. And he did tons of them, like tons of etchings, honestly. But the one I'm going to focus on, just to give you a kind of taste of how important Rembrandt is in printmaking, is this one called the Three Crosses. And the reason why this is thought to be such an important work of art is because it's like it turns a print into a painting, because he uses such dramatic light and dark, almost as if he was using color, but he's not. He's just using black and white. And the other like really critical thing that makes this painting, well, I shouldn't call it a painting, that makes this print stand out, I suppose, to art historians, is that Rembrandt changed the metal plate every time he printed it. So instead of treating his print like something that was just factory-like, like could be reproduced the same time, in the same way a million times, he decided to kind of manipulate the actual block before he remade it. So it exists in all these different versions. This is a bad reproduction. But basically, depending on the version that he printed, he would, make it look darker, scratch out more areas, or make areas lighter by covering them with wax. So yeah, and this basically was him saying that printing is a medium that can be used purely for artistic exploration. It doesn't have to be a copy of something that needs to exist in the same version a million times, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but in the West, where there was this obsession with the original, unique work of art by one, genius, often male artist, it was like amazing. So, and we still have this obsession with originality, and it's it's something we should do a whole class on how contemporary artists and conceptual artists try to challenge this. But yeah, even aside from the point that these prints were making about the creative possibilities of printmaking, they are just like technically and artistically really amazing, because they're almost abstract, like especially this figure. They're so like jarring, the way that they're painted with just a few lines. I keep saying painted. So yes, Rembrandt is an artist. It's very difficult to do in 5 minutes, but it's worth, yeah, you really have to mention him if you're talking about printing in Europe. And if you Google him, you'll be bombarded with etchings. And it's a good exercise to use Durer and Rembrandt to actually try and start to be able to recognize the difference between a woodblock print, which is often quite rigid, an engraving, which is more detailed, and an etching, which is almost like allows the possibility for abstraction and shading and curved lines and all this stuff. So yeah, I will leave it in your hands if you're really interested in printmaking. But I didn't want to say anything else about Rembrandt so that we can get onto Japanese prints, which is another subject that you have to mention if you're talking about printmaking. But I've just seen on my notes that I have a quote from, I don't know which art historian, but they said, if we didn't have Rembrandt, we wouldn't have Goya. And if we didn't have Goya, we wouldn't have Picasso. And if we didn't have Picasso, we wouldn't have art as we know it today. And Rembrandt is the genesis of this. And this is obviously quite a traditional view of art history, which is like, you know, men influencing men influencing men. But it is certainly true that there are certain artists like Picasso who were really obsessed with the great painters that came before them. And they've mentioned Goya in the middle of this, who is an artist who I really don't know why we haven't spent more time on, but it was the same with the Spanish painting. It's just like, it's such a big subject. He's difficult to delve into without dedicating a whole session or something. But yeah, he was another major printmaker if anyone wants to look into it. So I thought that was a nice quote to end on that you can think about if you agree or disagree with. But we really have to get on to the Japanese printmaking, which is where the interesting stuff starts, in my opinion. So yeah, Japan is like a huge hub of printmaking in the history of art and historically, which kind of makes sense because Japan and China have always had a very close historical relationship. Like a lot of the Japanese, well, parts of the Japanese alphabet come from or use Chinese characters. So yeah, they influenced each other in many ways. And therefore, when China invented paper, it was really not long before it arrived in Japan, and woodblock printing was happening there very, very early. So that really early stuff I'm not going to focus on. I'm going to go straight into the 16th century, because actually the arrival of the printing press, like the more mechanical way of printing in Japan, is more unusual. And basically what happened is that the Jesuits got involved. They were a Catholic order, a Catholic religious group founded in 1534. And we've already seen in other classes how busy the Jesuits were in Brazil and Mexico, trying to convert people to Christianity. But one of the other places that they went is Japan. They started arriving in Japan in 1540, started trying to learn the language, and by the end of the 16th century, they started trying to produce texts in Japanese and images with a printing press to try and convert people to Christianity. So they actually brought over a printing press in 1590 from Portugal to Japan. And it wasn't a success, actually. So we may as well start with this image. Because the Japanese became increasingly suspicious of the Jesuits. And in 1622, 26 of the Jesuits were killed by the Japanese. as a kind of warning. And in 1639, they were ordered to leave Japan. And there are lots of prints about this subject that were widely disseminated in Europe, like this one that you're looking at. But the reason why this is so interesting is because the Jesuits didn't give up, and they continued to try and have influence in other parts of Asia. They had been trying to set up Jesuit schools in China since, I've got the exact date, since 1552. And it was one place where they hadn't been expelled, so they continued there. And this book that you're looking at, which you can see is like this strange combination of, you know, like Christ in the middle, and then Chinese characters, is actually a book that was made by a Jesuit missionary called Giulio Aleni. That's just my phone, nothing to worry about. Yeah, and he made this, I can see I haven't labeled it, which is very annoying, but he made it in 1637, and the title at the top reads in Chinese, Explanations on the Incarnation of the Heavenly Lord in Chinese. So this gives you an idea of how functional printing and printed images became for, you know, conversion, like religious conversion, and often that went hand in hand with colonialism, and it wasn't the case in China, but still it kind of gives you an idea of like the political effect of the ability to produce images like this so quickly. And apparently in this manuscript, this 1637 Catholic manuscript intended for Chinese people, the author really stresses the relationship between, well, I can't really say relationship, fabricates this fictional relationship between Christianity and Confucianism, and basically tries to make the point that Christianity is a more refined version of the values of Confucianism, in order to try and get people to convert. And I was reading an article that it said that the reason why the Jesuits in China and Japan chose Confucianism instead of Buddhism, which was another dominant religion, is because Buddhism by this point, and I mean since, you know, for centuries, if we think back to the Bamyan sculptures that we looked at in week 3, had been associated with this really iconic image of the Buddha. And they, you know, the Jesuits basically didn't think that these sort of images of Christ would, okay, it's disappeared, would be able to compete. Whereas Confucianism has less of a kind of strict icon and often involves portraits of people's ancestors instead of having this kind of Buddha-like or, you know, singular godly figure that's really recognizable visually. So they thought that it would be less threatening to the Christian image, which is interesting. And a digital version of this manuscript, and the title and everything will be in the notes, is actually available online now, which is great. Anyway, moving on to the other, well, to the Japanese prints now that we'll look at. The thing to note is that the Jesuits were not successful really in Japan, obviously, because they were expelled, or China. And especially not in Japan, because printing in Japan became one of the most important secular art forms, probably, in the history of art. You know, we've just looked at this Rembrandt print of Christ on the cross, and now we're going to be looking at a period of Japanese art history where printing was used really widely, and not to convey religious messages like Rembrandt was doing or like the Jesuits were doing. And this is a really kind of radical innovation. So, and we'll explain why, but I haven't checked questions for a while, so I'm just checking that. So far, so good. So Japan, you know, at the beginning of this Jesuit arrival and into the 19th century, was ruled by a very tyrannical dynasty. And it's known as the Edo period. I can't remember the name. I don't have it on my notes of the dynasty. Or do I? Anyway, I'll include it in the notes. But the Edo period in Japan, which runs from 1603 to 1868, so extremely long, is known for having really strict social hierarchies, being the rulers being quite tyrannical. But nonetheless, despite this, it's also known for the fact that the lower classes in the hierarchy basically created this super rich subculture of really provocative theatre, music, dance, fashion, and printing, basically. So it's interesting that, it's interesting that these things coincide. And it was such a rich subculture, like it was such an interesting time to be living in Japan, despite this tyrannical dynasty, that artists decided to start painting the everyday life of people in the cities. And it's hard to get across just how radical or distinctive this is in the history of art, but you have to remember that secular images of everyday people in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries isn't really happening in that many other places in the world at this point. And that's kind of why Japanese printmaking is so distinctive. And I actually included this comparison here so that you can see these two images of cities in the rain. The one on the right is a painting by Courbet that was seen as a really radical painting in France and in Europe, because it was just depicting something that was not just everyday, but also kind of like a bit miserable. So it wasn't even these beautiful impressionist cafe scenes. And Courbet was like this was the sort of legacy of realist painting in Europe, which developed in the 19th century and tried to depict workers and peasants and everyday life. And that's also what the Impressionists were doing, turning away from the academies who just wanted you to paint kings and queens and mythological Greek subjects. But this was happening in Europe in the 19th century, and it was seen as so radical. But actually in Japan, artists had been painting images of, people leaving, crossing bridges and walking home from work in the rain for centuries. So yeah, it's really, it's definitely an element of Japanese printing that is overlooked. And Japanese printing really inspired the Impressionists. So I just think this comparison is useful. And oh yeah, I had to include this. This is just one of the most beautiful Japanese prints, I think. And they capture like really small moments, like someone shaking snow off their umbrella or something, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but is it's not instinctive. Well, if you look at the history of art, it's not instinctive for humans to find beauty in these really small everyday moments. Like often we use images to immortalize these huge historical events, and that's not necessarily the case with Japanese printing. I just wanted to finish by saying that many of you may have been to the exhibition on Japanese printing that was at the Bristol Museum. I don't know when it was, a year ago or something, but I googled it and it's actually available fully online. I don't know if it's because of the current situation or whether it always has been, but it was a really good exhibition about the Edo period and printmaking under the Edo period, and how Japanese people turned to the enjoyment of everyday life and its representation. And one of the images included in that exhibition, which I briefly mentioned last week, is this print called Mosquito Net. And I just think it's so beautiful. Mainly, you know, from a technical point of view as well, you can see how thin the mosquito net is. And, you know, like I did with Durer, you have to really stress how difficult it is to achieve that on a technical level. But historically, it's also interesting because it represents two women in the Yoshiwara, which was the pleasure district in Edo. And it was known as a kind of floating city where prostitutes were widely available. Prostitutes isn't exactly the perfect translation, because they were actually they were quite high up on the social hierarchy, and they were quite respected and treated like celebrities. So, you know, prostitute, I suppose, doesn't have the right connotations. But nonetheless, these women, apparently, according to historians, once they settled into this social role and position, it was very hard for them to escape. So it certainly wasn't a liberating or emancipatory period for Japanese women, I suppose. And I just think this print captures some of that tension, maybe, you know, because she's sort of half hiding and half coming out. That's just how I interpret it. And there is a whole section in the Bristol Museum exhibition on the Yoshiwara district. And it also includes this print, which has the amazing title of The Watchers and the Watched. And you can kind of see people looking in. And I just thought it was a really good one to end on, because it brings us back to really the Picasso's 156 engravings, which were kind of questioning, which were all about looking, you know, the male artist and the female nude, or like the male voyeur and the female prostitute in this case. So yeah, I think this one is another interesting one that you can make that argument with. So yes, this is my brief introduction to the traditional history of European printmaking, and then a very brief introduction on Japanese printmaking in the Edo period. But it's 7 o'clock, so I should